If you've come to this video, you probably know why composting is important, but I'm not sure that many people understand just how important it truly is. First and foremost, food does not break down in the landfill. Where there's a lack of oxygen and sunlight, food cannot break down properly. This is because the composting cycle can't happen without oxygen and sunlight, two things which food buried under layers and layers of non-biodegradable material does not get. The US has more than any other country with 40 million tons of food going to waste per year, 220 pounds per person, which is around 30 to 40% of the entire food supply. As I said, food does not break down in the landfill, so instead it sits there in this weird limbo state, emitting a very powerful greenhouse gas called methane. Methane is around 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and because of this, food waste contributes to 11% of the world's emissions, which is obviously contributing to the climate crisis. If food waste were its own country, it would be the third largest polluter in the world behind the US and China. And according to the World Wildlife Federation, the production of wasted food in the US is equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions of 37 million cars. The average American family throws out $1,600 of food a year, times 18 years could easily pay for a worth of tuition at any American private college. And in the US, individuals are responsible for the majority of the food waste. 43% comes from households, 40% comes from grocery stores, restaurants, and all those things combined. 16% comes from farms, and 2% comes from manufacturers. If you weren't already convinced composting is important, I hope this changes your mind. Now that we understand why composting is so important, let's talk about how we can compost. Because food waste is such a massive video, I decided to make one video where we could talk about all the ways that you can compost no matter your circumstances. I personally compost in 4 different ways in my home, which we'll get to later, but in order to show you the widest array of ways that you can compost, I decided to ask some of your favorite creators how they're composting in their home so we can get an idea of the wide array of options you have for composting. And one of the most highly requested things that I've gotten recently is about the Lomi composter by Pila. This is a countertop compost, which I think is an amazing option for anybody who lives in a small space, an apartment, or anyone who doesn't have their own yard, or any of the other options we're going to talk about today. The Lomi compost can turn food scraps into soil amendment in less than 4 hours, using less energy than an oven would in 16 minutes. I'll share more about this option later on in the video, but if you actually want your chance to win your own Lomi compost, I'm going to be hosting a giveaway over on my Instagram for 3 people to win one of your very own countertop compost. So I'll leave that linked in the description and you can go check it out. But before we talk about the Lomi composter, let's talk about some other ways you can compost regardless of the situation you're in. The first one we're going to talk about is a really cool option I think we're going to start seeing in more densely populated areas. So let's talk about it.
My name's Anna. I have a YouTube channel called Anna's Analysis, and I've been composting for about 2.5 years, ever since I moved to San Antonio, Texas. Basically, I've been using this monthly subscription-based service called Compost Queens. I live in an apartment, so I didn't have the option of having the organics recycling program that the city does here. So I did some research, and that's how I found this company. What they do is they basically supply you with all the things that you need. So they give you this 5-gallon bucket. They also give you a biodegradable bag to put in it, and then you get Bokashi flakes. The method of composting that they use is called Bokashi, and basically what it means is that these things help the material ferment, and so that helps it all break down a lot easier. On the side of the bucket here, they list what you can and can't put in here. So of course, fruits and veggies can go in there. You can do meat and fish, coffee grinds, even bones, I guess, bread, pasta. What you can't do is paper and yard waste and a few other things. So what I do is I have a big bowl to put my food scraps in when I'm cooking, and then I usually just keep it in the freezer until it gets full. Then I take it out to my patio where I keep my bucket, and I'll dump it in there, sprinkle a bit of the Bokashi flakes over top, and put the lid back on. Then once it gets full, the company gives you the option to either drop off your bucket at one of their drop-off locations throughout the city, which makes the service cost $15 a month. When you're there, you'd pick up your new bucket, bag, and refill the Bokashi flakes. Or for $28 a month, they'll come to your home and pick up the full bucket and leave you with all your new stuff every 4 weeks. I just dropped mine off because $15 is already pretty expensive for what it is. But then, they take your compost, they turn it into soil, and they distribute it to different local community farms, which is cool. Aside from the price, I really like the service. It's, I've been using it for over 2.5 years. I think it's really great if you live in an apartment or just somewhere where you don't have access to like a city recycling program. Of course, they're not gonna have these services in like every city, but I'm glad they have it where I live. I mean, I wouldn't know what to do. I don't have anywhere to put my own compost, so it's really nice that they take it when you're done with it and they put it to good use. So, and then another nice thing about it is that the Bokashi, the fermentation process, basically also helps minimize odors. So if you keep this bucket like right in your kitchen, I mean, I keep it outside, but you could have it right in your kitchen and it wouldn't smell at all. As long as you're keeping the lid on tight, you're good to go. So yeah, that's the composting method that I use.
Composting Queens here in San Antonio is an amazing option, and it's worth giving it a Google to see if anything similar is in your area. It's a great option for if you live in an apartment like Anna does, and I have a few other options that would work really well if you're in an apartment. Before I got this house and I had room in my backyard to do some of my own composting, I actually utilized one of these methods, which is drop-off compost. The way I did it when I had an apartment is I was actually part of a community garden, so I would take my compost and dump it at my community garden. People in the community could bring their compost by. You didn't have to be a member of the garden, but it was just what we were doing because we were also members of our garden. Other drop-off options include asking a farmer near you, maybe contacting them when you see them at the farmer's market, asking if they would be willing to take your compost, or just finding anyone in your area who composts, not just the community garden, not just the farmers, but maybe even your neighbor. If you get to know more people, which I have become super passionate about recently, and building community, you might just find someone right down the street who has a compost. But if you're not able to do that, or if you can't find anyone, there's actually an incredible app called the Share Waste app that is meant to do exactly that. Find someone with compost and match them to someone who has a compost. I'll leave the app linked in the description, and I think this is an awesome way for anyone to find access to compost, but also a really great way to make some friends and build community. Now let's hear from someone else who lives in an apartment but composts in a completely different way.
Hello everyone, my name is Levi. You might know me as one half of Levi and Leah on YouTube, and today I'm going to show you how we deal with our compost. This is a standard steel bucket, nothing too interesting about it, and inside, as you can see, we have a variety of food scraps. Here in Victoria, BC, where we live, we actually have a compost pickup service through our municipality, so that means that all food scraps and yard waste that you can fit into your green bin gets taken by the city and turned into compost that is then redistributed throughout the area in the form of compost for like farmers and people's gardens, and you can just go there and ask them for it if you want some, which we haven't actually done, but might be kind of cool to try in the future. So these are the two bins that we are allowed to put our organic waste in. Most of the time they're actually relatively full, but today this one's a little empty. As you can see, there's a bag inside of here, and that's really important because that means that our raw compost material doesn't make the bin all gross and disgusting. So we swap this out probably once every week or so, but that being said, we work from home and we cook quite a bit, and most of what we eat is completely plant-based, so this is probably the smallest bin that I would recommend, depending on the size of your family. We don't use any plastic or biodegradable bags for our compost. Instead, what we use is paper bags that we get from grocery shopping and picking up bread, etc. And then that just lays down on the bottom so nothing gets stuck to the bottom of the bin. It helps with cleaning, helps with smell of the container over time. Just a little side note, we used to have a plastic bin, but plastic bins absorb the smell over time in our experience, and then the whole bin just kind of smells terrible, and then you're less likely to want to use your compost, and that is bad. So this steel alternative was really, really great. On the inside of the lid, you can see there's like that little black foamy thing, and that prevents smell from getting out of here, even though right now it just kind of smells like nice vegetable matter. Anyway, let's go toss it out.
So when I said that we compost in 4 different ways in this home, I just want to make sure that I let you know what all the ways are. And one of the ways is very, very similar to Levi's in that we have these 3 bins out in our yard. One is for trash, that's the smallest one. And then we have one for recycling and one for compost. The coolest thing to me about these 3 bins is actually we only pay for the trash one. Composting and recycling is completely free. And since we are a low waste household, we have the smallest bin, which is the cheapest one. And what I really admire the city of San Antonio for is that composting and recycling is free for everybody, but also that they have inspectors that come around and make sure that everybody's doing it correctly. So we actually got in trouble once because we put paper compostable like clamshells in our compost, and the inspectors who come by and make sure that everyone's doing it right flagged us because they thought it was styrofoam, which was like really nice that they were actually keeping track of things that shouldn't be in the compost and letting people know. So educating people, which is really important, but not good because they flagged something that was totally compostable as not. But I digress. That's just one of the ways I compost. We'll talk more about the rest in the video. Now, sticking with the topic of apartments, because I know a lot of people who watch this channel live in apartments or in small spaces or spaces where you don't have a lot of yard, there is an option to have worms inside your home. Whether you want to do that or not, I don't know. I personally have never tried this method, but I know Shia over from Wasteland Rebel has, and I'll link a couple of her posts where she talks about it in the description. She seems to have had great luck with it, but I will tell you also that my friend Catherine tried this method and she wasn't very good at it and ended up killing all of her worms. So if you don't want that on your conscience, there are other options here, which like I said, we already talked about, we're gonna continue to talk about, but that is an option. You can have a worm bin in your home. You can also have a worm bin outside of your home, and I actually have a friend named Lauren who does this.
Hi, Shelby. Hi everyone, I'm Lauren. I go by Lauren on all the things, and I'm kind of obsessed with composting. We grew up composting. My mom taught us how to compost when we were pretty young. She's got like a massive composting system in her backyard, but today I'm gonna show you how we do it. So first things first, we have this little bucket. I think it's like a motel ice bucket, but I got it at the thrift shop for like $1. But we put all of our food scraps in here. And then we put the whole thing in the freezer. So I live in Costa Mesa, California, and we're really fortunate that we have curbside organic waste. However, it's not really composting because what they're doing is burning the organic waste and then capturing the energy from it and using it as fuel. But that process still doesn't return the nutrients back into the soil. And we have quite a garden operation in the back. So let's take this out and I'll show you our setup. What a beautiful day. Okay, so we have 2 outdoor composting setups. This is our compost tumbler. As you can see, she's lived a wonderful life. And then over here we have our worm beds. So these are essentially 4 walls with nothing on the bottom. So the worms are actually touching the earth, whereas this is obviously like a raised composting situation. Okay, here we go. Wow. Can you see all of them? Worms. I swear they're like pets. You check on them, you feed them, you make sure they're happy, you change their bedding. So now we're gonna aerate them, which essentially just brings air through the bottom. This actually looks pretty good. Oh yeah, baby. And then the lid goes back on. The brick goes back on for safety. There you go. Look, it fits perfect. And then the most important part about compost that nobody tells you about is that you have to add brown waste or like carbon waste to your compost. Otherwise it'll just rot and get really stinky and attract a lot of flies. So our gardener brought a ton of mulch the other day, so I'm just gonna add some of the mulch. And carbon can be anything, right? Leaves, pine needles, whatever. And then we close it up. Give her a twirl. Give her a ton.
I decided to try this method of compost after I found one of these tumblers on the side of the road. The reason I decided to try doing this method, even though I wasn't sending any food to landfill because the city has the free curbside compost, the problem is once COVID started, they weren't really giving us compost anymore, and it was really hard to know when they were actually allowing us to go get it. Like when I would need compost for the garden, I'd have to figure out, do they have it right now? When are they gonna have it again? Like, are they gonna have it when I need it in general? So that was one of the problems with this composting method, but the other problem is that the breaking down of food really wasn't happening at a rate that seemed to be like productive. And as much as I like a challenge out in the garden, if something is not working, I'm gonna look for a better way to do so. But that's just been my experience with this method. I think the tumbler and the worm bin, like Lauren have, are good options if you have an outside space, but not a lot of it. Yes, I have a garden, yes, I have an outdoor space, but I also want to have that space to grow food, and I have chickens, so they need their space too. But if you have a bit more space, you can do a more traditional method, which my friend Megan actually utilizes.
My name is Megan Hughes. I'm a 24-year-old homesteader living outside of Portland, Oregon, and I compost just using a backyard compost system. My partner Finley built us this like pallet box of sorts, and it has chicken wire on all of the sides to keep in all of our compost, and we just keep it on the side of our back porch so we can throw all of our scraps off, empty out our jars that we keep for compost in the bathrooms, in our bathroom and in our guest bathroom. And because we have 2 pigs who poop a lot, we have a separate manure compost, and then once it kind of gets broken down, we shovel some of that into our house compost. So we have kind of 2 different piles and systems, but they both work. So the reason I chose the backyard compost method is because it's relatively simple. I didn't really know a lot about composting when I started it, and I still don't. I'm not even acting like I know that much about composting. This is just what works for us. So like I mentioned before, we live in Oregon in farm country, and a lot of people around us, they farm their own food, grow their own food, and we started doing that the same year that we moved here, and we kind of realized, wait, where do we get all of the soil from? Is the soil here good? How do we make it better? What plants need certain kind of nutrients, and where can we find those nutrients? And the answer was compost. So that's kind of why we started composting, I guess. And through composting, a plus is that we get to utilize all of our throwaway food scraps, all of our paper waste, cardboard waste, and once it all breaks down, we can feed our food with the compost, and it just all becomes a circular system where then we get to feed ourselves. We eat the vegetables that we grow, we turn them back into compost, and it's just this whole circular thing. As you can tell on the sides of the compost as well, those big bushes on the sides of the compost have grown so much since we started composting. So it really just goes to show that the compost is totally feeding these plants and making them just grow so big and mighty. And then when we want to use the compost, we just shovel it out from the bottom. We honestly don't use a significant amount of it because we supplement our soil with our pig manure as well. So just the mixture of the two. Sometimes we put in organic material like hay or straw or something like that to break it up a little bit as well. But the main thing that I use my compost for is like a handful of feed for one specific plant. So I'll grab like 1 shovelful or 1 handful of soil and pack it around the base of the plant so that it will feed it better and give it more nutrients. And that's really the main use of our compost right now. Live, laugh, love compost, brothers. Thanks for listening, and thanks for having me, Shelby. Happy to share.
You can see Megan's composting method is very traditional with an open air bin. But there's another way to do a method that is kind of similar, and it's an in-ground compost. Now there are a lot of different ways to do this. People do it in so many different ways. I personally do it in my backyard in a very, very particular way because that's how I compost my pet waste. My in-ground composting system is right here. So basically what happened is we used to have an orange tree right here, and in the winter freeze last year, if you heard about the fiasco in Texas, it died. We had to rip it up, and to replace it, we decided to finally do an in-ground composting system, which is the way I compost my pet waste. Now specifically if you're trying a method like mine, you need to make sure that wherever you put this, it is at least 10 foot away from wherever you're going to be planting food in the ground. This is the reason pet waste cannot go in like a municipal curbside compost or anything that could end up where someone is eating, because the pathogens that is in cat feces, not good for us to be eating, can make us really sick. There are a few different ways to do in-ground options. There are a few different ways to do the hole, a few different ways to have a bin like this, or you can dig a deeper hole and just have the lid basically on the ground. But this one's really, really simple. Basically, I put some worms in there when I first started this compost. I use a compostable litter, and as I clean the litter box, I add it to this bin right here. And I don't expect that this would be something a lot of people would want to do, but it's something that someone who is a little bit neurotic and extra about saving the planet does to reduce the waste from having a cat. So that is one of the 4 ways we compost in this house. Those in-ground composting systems can be done, I believe, just naturally with some turning. It can also be done with worms like we talked about. They can also be done with Bokashi system. So this is a way of introducing different bacteria and things that naturally break down your food. Enzymes and things like that will help to break down your food much like it would in your stomach. Bokashi is actually a system that you can do outside in the ground like I'm talking about, but you can also do Bokashi in your home. I've personally never utilized this method, but if it's something that you're interested in, I definitely recommend Kevin Espertu over at Epic Gardening. He has a great video all about it if you want to learn how to utilize this system. Each of these different methods have their pros and their cons, and deciding which one of these is going to work best to you might mean looking at different people who are actually doing these things. So I'll leave Kevin's video linked below if you want to learn more about the Bokashi system. Now, to take it to the most simple way that you can compost, you can actually build a DIY plastic bin. This method technically doesn't require any worms, any Bokashi, not too much turning, not too much of anything, and I don't know anyone who has done this and been like,
I got the best compost out of this system.
It's also kind of limited in the amount of stuff that you can actually compost. And according to the stats that we heard at the beginning of the video, we need a system that's going to be able to handle a lot of food waste. I know my friend Catherine did test this out a while back in her last apartment, and it seemed to have worked okay for her, but she also was able to utilize curbside composting similar to what Levi was using shortly after that. So I'm not sure if she ever shared like if that's something she would choose to do long term, but if you're on a budget and you live in an apartment and you don't want worms and you don't want Bokashi, this is also an option. So I'll leave her blog post linked below with more details of how she did it and how it worked. And we'll go from the most simple to the most complicated, which is the other way that I compost in my home. Now, even though this composting method is not easy, it is definitely one of the most rewarding. So chickens are a great option for composting because they eat a ton of stuff. Like, they don't eat to get full, they just eat and eat and eat, and as they eat, their body processes it and they poop it out, and their poop is wonderful nutrients for growing new foods. Now, you'd think with that in mind they would eat nearly anything, but my chickens in particular are picky little buttholes. Isn't that right? But some of my favorite foods include kale scraps, tomatoes, eggshells. Obviously, chickens wouldn't be the easiest or most accessible way to compost, but if you're able to have chickens, they are a great way to get some awesome nutrients into your soil. Now, the very exciting method, which is the Lomi composter that I know so many of you want to hear about. I'll tell you a little bit about my experience testing it out over the last few months. First of all, this is a very fun solution to composting. Composting in general is fun to watch something literally in your own space turn from waste to nutrient-rich compost. It's incredible no matter which method you do it, but being able to do it in a single day, there's something like miraculous about it that makes me feel like a scientist in my own home. And even though I compost in a few other ways in my home, this might be the most fun one I've done, and the one that I like the most. Simply because it's so easy to utilize the soil amendment that comes out of it. But with Lomi, I'm able to literally take the residual materials that I get from composting and put it directly on my garden, and the garden immediately gets to start reaping the benefits of those nutrients. And in addition to that, it's not messy at all. Most of the questions I got surrounded, number one, if I live in an apartment, what the hell am I gonna do with the dirt afterwards? When I lived in my first apartment in college, I would just throw my food scraps out in the bushes in front of our building. Yeah, a few potatoes sprouted from that. But honestly, if I was using the Lomi compost and I was getting dirt out of it, I would just do the same thing, put it back into nature anywhere that I could. And people have asked me if it smells. Now, To be fair, I have an awful sense of smell. So when I tested out the Lomi for the first time, my brother-in-law was there who did smell it, and he said when he got close to it, it smelled like roasted vegetables. But I couldn't smell it at all. Lomi does have a dual carbon filtration system which absorbs the odors, so they've already thought about that for you, and I don't think it's a big area of concern. And a lot of people want to know how long it takes. So Lomi actually has 3 cycles. They have a 4-hour, a 10-hour, and a 20-hour cycle, and each of the materials that come out of each of those cycles is going to be a little bit different. That's why they have the 3 different ones to choose from. If you have any other questions about the Lomi compost, or honestly any of the composting methods we talked about today, let me know in the comments and I'll try to do my best to get back to you if I am able to find the answers to your questions, because I'm not a composting goddess. I'm just doing my best over here, and that's all I expect of anybody watching this video. Also, if you want a chance to win a Lomi compost, don't forget to go check out my giveaway over on my Instagram. I also want to include just a few do's and don'ts for composting. The first do is just do it. Literally, whatever you have to do to figure out how to stop sending food waste to landfill is going to be a huge, huge benefit to the environment overall. And do keep trying. Like I said, the first time I ever tried to compost, I thought literally all you had to do was put it in a bucket and it would compost, because everybody on the internet kind of talks about these compost bins, but nothing composts in that bin. As you've seen today, you actually have to have a process. The bin is just storage. But if I had given up after that, then I would have never made it to where I'm actually reducing my waste, right? My second try, started growing potatoes in front of my apartment complex. If the first method you tried doesn't work, use another method in this video. I'm hoping that there's something in here for everyone. Do research if something is compostable or not. Depending on which system you're using, there are certain food scraps that can't go into them. So whichever system you're using, try to do a little bit of research figuring that out. Most systems do not want you to put things like animal products in them, so be aware of that. And my personal favorite tip and do is store your compost in your freezer. Wonderful. It works out great for everyone in the home. Do not mistake sending food waste to landfill as equal to compost. As I outlined in the beginning, it most certainly is not. And when I was younger, I definitely thought, well, it's biodegradable. I'm just gonna throw it in the landfill. But that's not how things work. And more importantly to me than throwing food in the landfill and it not actually breaking down is that we are depleting our soils of nutrients, just constantly taking nutrients out of our soils to grow this food and then putting it in a hole in the ground to never be recovered again. And that system is quite literally impossible to sustain. So please don't do that. And that's about all of the things I had to tell you today. I'm gonna have a ton of links for you in the bottom in the description. Don't forget to go check out the giveaway over on Instagram. And remember, until next time, you cannot do all the good that the world needs, but the world needs all the good that you can do. Bye guys.